The first time you hear a Nate Dogg hook, you remember exactly where you were. Maybe it was in a car with the windows down. Maybe it was on a cracked radio in a crowded apartment. Maybe it was on a late night when the world felt heavier than usual. But his voice made everything feel steady, almost safe, like the West Coast had its own heartbeat and he was the one keeping time. People like to argue about who the new king of hooks is, who carries the sound forward, who might be the next in line. But every time that debate comes up, the truth stands in the room, like a shadow you cannot ignore. There was only one Nate Dogg, and there will never be another. He was the voice behind an era, the sound that stitched together gangster, rap, and R, and B, the calm under the chaos. But that voice did not come from fame or polish or studio perfection. It came from a boy raised in church pews, shaped by gospel rhythms, hardened by the streets of Long Beach, and lifted by a talent that seemed almost too natural to be taught. This is not just a story about a singer. It is the story of the man who gave West Coast hip-hop its soul. Before the world knew him as Nate Dogg, before the hooks, before the fame, before the weight of the West Coast rested on his voice, he was just Nathaniel Hale, a quiet boy born in Clarksdale, Mississippi. His world began in a small town where the church was not only a building but a rhythm, a place where voices rose like a second kind of breathing. His father was a pastor, his mother led the children's choir, and the Hale household revolved around hymns that carried both comfort and discipline. It was in that space, at around 6 years old, that Nate first learned how to fill a room with a voice that felt older than he was. The family sang together as the Hale Family Gospel Group, traveling from church to church, lifting songs that spoke of struggle and redemption. Even then, before life hardened him, before the Marines, before the streets, he carried a tone that blended gentleness with something deeper, something almost ancient. But childhood does not remain untouched, and when Nate was 14, his parents' marriage fell apart. His mother packed up the family and moved them to Long Beach, California, a place that would shape every part of the man he would become. Long Beach, in the 1,980 seconds, was not the polished version the world sees today. It was rough, alive, unpredictable. It was where music and danger lived, side by side, and where friendships were forged out of survival as much as joy. It was there, in a classroom at Long Beach Polytechnic High School, that Nate met two boys who would change his life. Calvin Broadus, who the world would later call Snoop Dogg, and Warren Griffin, who would become Warren G. At school, Snoop rapped with a natural ease that made the other kids stop and stare. Warren G was quieter, always listening, always arranging sound in his head. Nate, meanwhile, did not rap. He came from gospel, from harmony, from structure. He sang, not with the polish of an R&B singer, not with the softness usually expected of church-trained voices, but with a weight that made people turn toward him. Even then, he carried the mix of street and soul that would become his signature. The three boys became inseparable. They played football together, shot hoops together, walked home together, and for a while, they even prayed together. They were just kids then, trying to find space in a world that did not offer easy paths. But life pushed them harder than most. Nate eventually dropped out of high school at 17 and joined the Marines. He wanted direction, structure, a way out. But the discipline of the service clashed with the storms he carried inside him, and after a series of unauthorized returns home, he was discharged. By the time he returned to Long Beach, things had changed. Work was hard to find. Money was even harder. He drifted into the streets, trying to survive, until a robbery charge tightened the walls around him. In the middle of all this, he reconnected with Snoop and Warren G, who had their own struggles and had been kicked out of their mothers' homes as well. And in that shared hardship, something took shape. Three young men, broke, tired, and uncertain, decided to build something of their own. Snoop would rap, Warren G would handle the beats, and Nate would do what only he could do. He would sing. They called themselves 213, after the Long Beach area code, inspired by Richie Rich's rap group 415. They recorded in friends' living rooms, in small back rooms at VIP Records, anywhere they could find a mic and a moment. They poured everything they had into homemade tapes that traveled across Los Angeles, one copy at a time. No one knew it yet, but these tapes were the spark that would change West Coast hip-hop forever. And at the center of that spark was the voice that would someday define an era. When you trace the rise of West Coast hip-hop, there is a moment where everything changes. A moment where a homemade tape, carried from one house party to another, lands in the right hands. For Nate, Snoop, and Warren G, that moment came the night Warren G slipped their demo into the music at a party Dr. Dre was hosting. The room shifted. People stopped talking. Heads turned. The rawness, the honesty, the blend of street rhythm and soulful melody pulled everyone in. And when Dre asked, "Who is that?" the door to an entirely new chapter opened. Dre told Warren G to bring Snoop to the studio. Nate came along, not knowing that his voice would soon help shape a sound the world would never forget. The Chronic was in motion, a project that would redefine hip-hop, and Nate found himself woven into its foundation. His voice floated through tracks like These Nuts and Lil Ghetto Boy, adding a warmth and gravity that balanced the rawness of the lyrics. He was not the face of the movement, but he was its tone, the element that made each moment hit deeper. The Chronic exploded, triple platinum, turning the West Coast into the center of the hip-hop universe. And when it came time to build Snoop Dogg's debut album, Doggy Style, Nate was there again, grounding each track with the unmistakable calm in his voice. Then came Ain't No Fun, a song that lived in clubs, in cars, on every mixtape, a track where Nate's hook became the anthem of an era. He did not just sing, he stamped the moment. But the true breakthrough, the one that catapulted him from familiar collaborator to a name the world could not ignore, came when Warren G signed with Def Jam and asked Nate to join him on a single, Regulate, a song that felt like a movie, a conversation, a confession, a piece of West Coast scripture. The way Nate opened it, smooth and steady, felt like the beginning of a story you had to hear to the end. Regulate climbed to number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100, number 1 on the rap charts, and earned a Grammy nomination. It cemented Nate Dogg as the king of hooks. It made clear that there were rappers, and then there was Nate, the man who could lift a song with just a few words. Yet, even with the success, industry politics wrapped around him like chains. Def Jam wanted to sign him, but Suge Knight shut it down instantly. Nate was signed to Death Row, and Death Row did not let go. The problem was that they held him close, but kept him quiet. Years passed. Nate sang on hit after hit, carried choruses that became cultural anchors, and still, no solo album. At a time when he should have been rising as a solo star, he was broke, stuck, overlooked by the very machine that used his voice to fuel its empire. He was so low on money that at one point he robbed a Taco Bell, a story Suge later claimed he helped cover up to keep Nate out of prison. Whether the details were twisted or true, the reality was simple. Nate was the soul of West Coast hip-hop, but he was not being treated like it. Still, the work he did shook the world. He became the sound you heard when a track needed weight, heart, or swagger. He was the bridge between R&B and gangster rap, the voice artists called when they needed the finishing touch. By the late 90s, even without a solo album, Nate Dogg was a legend in motion, a man whose name in the credits guaranteed the song would hit harder. He had climbed from gospel pews to the center of a revolution. He had become irreplaceable, and soon, the world would see just how much the era depended on him. For every voice that rises, there is a breaking point the world never sees coming. And for Nate Dogg, that breaking point arrived long after the fame, the hits, and the legendary hooks had turned him into the backbone of West Coast hip-hop. It came quietly, hidden beneath the weight of the streets, the pressure of the industry, and the choices that had followed him from boyhood. Success did not protect Nate from the parts of life that refused to let him breathe. Legal trouble followed him like a long shadow. There were arrests for assault, accusations of domestic violence, charges connected to weapons and threats. He was in and out of courtrooms, trying to navigate a world where fame could open doors but could not hide the damage happening behind them. Each headline painted him as dangerous, but those close to him knew the truth was more complicated. Nate was fighting battles that came from old wounds, old habits, and a life that had never fully healed. He had a reputation for drinking heavily, a habit that friends said could turn warm laughter into something darker. They called that version of him Buddy Love, a man with a temper sharp enough to cut through any room he entered. The industry around him was loud, chaotic, and often violent, and Nate carried that chaos home with him. But even in the worst moments, his voice remained steady on the tracks he recorded, as if the music was the only place he could still be whole. In 2007, fought struck hard. Nate and his girlfriend were in a car accident so severe that the vehicle flipped multiple times. He was badly injured, bleeding internally, his head cut and stapled. Doctors urged caution. They warned him to rest. But Nate, driven by the same urgency that had pushed him through every struggle of his life, checked himself out of the hospital and went to perform a show in Las Vegas. The body can only take so much. The mind can only take so much. Not long after, Nate suffered his first stroke. It weakened the left side of his body, the side he depended on the most, because Nate was left-handed. He tried to push through it, determined to keep going, but he did so while drinking heavily, mixing alcohol with medication in ways that were more dangerous than he understood. His friends visited him in the hospital, shocked to see him lying there with a bottle of Hennessy next to his bed, as if he was trying to anchor himself to the only comfort he trusted. For a brief period, it looked like he might recover. He tried to change his life. He talked about forming a gospel group, wanting to create music his parents could finally listen to without turning away. There were recordings of choir rehearsals that showed glimpses of a man trying to return to the peace of his childhood. But the damage inside him was deeper than he knew. In September 2008, Nate suffered a second massive stroke. This one was catastrophic. It left him paralyzed from the neck down, unable to walk, unable to speak, stripped of every physical ability that had once carried his gift. People who visited him said the silence in the room felt heavier than grief itself. The man, who had given the world some of its most iconic melodies, could no longer lift his own voice. From that point on, his days were marked by struggle, therapy, medical bills, and the quiet heartbreak of watching life narrow into something he could not escape. He fought for years, but the damage never let go. On the 15th of March 2011, Nate Dogg passed away at the age of 41, taken by complications from multiple strokes. A voice that had once defined an era fell silent, and the world felt smaller without him. In the months after Nate Dogg's passing, the world tried to understand what it had lost. For many, the news felt unreal. How could a voice so deeply woven into the culture of the West Coast simply disappear? How could someone whose sound had shaped a generation be gone at 41, leaving behind more silence than answers? Across the United States, the reaction was layered. Fans mourned not only the artist, but the era he represented. In barbershops, on radio shows, in small living rooms filled with old CDs and dusty speakers, people talked about the first time they heard him. They talked about how his hooks carried them through breakups, late-night drives, and long summers that seemed to stretch forever. For many Americans, Nate Dogg was not background music. He was memory. He was mood. He was a part of them. Artists across the country spoke up too. Some called him the backbone of West Coast hip-hop. Others said he was the missing instrument in songs that would not have become hits without him. Ice Cube described him as essential. Big Boy said the West Coast was built on his voice. Charlie Wilson said he brought real R&B to a world that needed it. These were not empty condolences. They were acknowledgements of a truth the industry had always known, even if it did not always treat him as such. Internationally, the response was softer, more reflective. European fans who had grown up listening to Chronic and Doggy Style held small gatherings, lighting candles and playing Regulate on repeat. Hip-hop forums in Japan, Brazil, and Germany filled with tributes, each one echoing the same message. The world had lost a sound that could never be recreated. It was remarkable how far his voice had traveled, reaching corners he had never seen, becoming a soundtrack for people who had never stepped foot in Long Beach. But alongside the mourning came frustration. Many questioned how a man so influential could die with medical debt, legal battles, and unresolved family conflict hanging over him. Some pointed out that despite decades of supporting the biggest names in the industry, few stepped forward to help with his care. Others wondered how his estate became tangled in disputes almost immediately after his death, with accusations, court filings, and bitterness overshadowing the grieving process. Yet, through all the complications, all the noise, one truth remained clear. Nate Dogg had given hip-hop something that would outlive every controversy. He had given it a feeling, a depth, a soul. And that gift belonged not to labels or estates, but to the people who heard him and recognized the honesty in every note. In the years after Nate Dogg's passing, the world continued to move. New artists rose, new sounds took over the charts, and the landscape of hip-hop shifted once again. But something was missing. There was a space in the culture that no one could quite fill, a silence that grew louder each time a hook felt empty, each time a chorus needed weight, and there was no voice deep enough, smooth enough, grounded enough to carry it. That absence was Nate. His career had not been clean, perfect, or easy. It carried the weight of struggle, the turbulence of fame, the consequences of choices made in moments of anger or pain. But legends are not shaped by perfection. They are shaped by impact, by honesty, by the parts of themselves they leave behind even after they are gone. And Nate Dogg left behind a sound that remains unmistakable. He reshaped the meaning of a hook, turning it from a simple chorus into a spine, something that held a song upright. He blended gospel roots with street reality, creating a tone that felt both dangerous and comforting. He gave a generation its soundtrack for both celebration and grief, for nights that spun out of control and mornings that came too early. Without him, West Coast hip-hop would not look or sound the same. His personal life, with all its conflict and hardship, leaves a different kind of legacy. A reminder that even the artists who seem unshakable can be worn down by the world. A reminder that fame does not protect a man from his demons, his history, or the weight of unhealed wounds. A reminder that health, both physical and mental, must be guarded with the same care as success. For his family, his friends, and his sons who now carry pieces of his voice in their own music, Nate's story is both a warning and an inheritance. A warning about the cost of the life he lived, and an inheritance of talent, strength, and truth they can build on. If the music industry has a heart, Nate helped form a part of its beat. If the West Coast has a soul, his voice is still echoing inside it. Some lives end quietly. Some end in chaos. But the ones that matter leave something behind that does not fade. Nate Dogg's voice did not vanish when he did. It remains in the songs that shaped the 90 seconds, in the hooks that defined the 2000s, and in the memories of anyone who ever felt grounded by the calm strength in his tone. He was only 41, too young, far too young. But legends are measured not in years, they are measured in echoes, and Nate Dogg still echoes.